Welcome to the second EUMOFA Talk. This is the second of what we hope will become a regular series of webinars where we will invite experts to discuss cutting-edge topics about fishery and aquaculture. We made, as EUMOFA, the first one in February, and it regarded the Blue Bioeconomy report that was recently released on EUMOFA. And we also published the video recording in the news section. The same will be done today for this talk, and it will be published on the EUMOFA website in the news section in the next few days. I am quite excited today because that's the first episode that I moderate. I hope I will be a good host, but most of all, I hope that you will enjoy it. We are going to talk about the study that was released last week on EUMOFA regarding the impact of imports of fish products to the EU on the small-scale coastal fleet, in particular their impact on vessels under 12 meters that use passive gear. This is a topic that so far has received not much attention and research, in particular when compared to imports of terrestrial food and their impact on agricultural production. In this case, the potential impact is a combination of two necessary conditions. First, that imported products and domestic production function as substitutes. And second, that producers are price takers in the market, meaning they lack market power to influence prices. Of course, the impact of imports is different on a case-by-case studies. In the context of the study, we made 13 case studies. And while for 10 of them, this market integration was found to be loose or almost non-existent, for 3 of them, production was found to be integrated with extra EU imports, even if to a moderate extent. The 3 we're talking about are cod in southern Sweden, lobster in the north of France, and octopus in Spain. We assessed these 3 case studies, and results are included in the report. So today we're going to discuss them, and particularly we're going to give a special focus about the lobster one in France. I will be not alone. I will be I have the pleasure to host this talk with a panel of experts that you can see in your screen. Griffin Carpenter, one of the authors of this study, who will tell us about the study objectives and main findings. And he will also explain its background in terms of patterns in seafood trade and policy context. Raymond Maes, a policy officer from DG MARE, who will give a presentation on the small-scale coastal fleet in the EU. And Sebastian Metz, another author of this study, who will present the 3 case studies I was talking about with a special focus on lobster. I would like to remind all of you in the audience that throughout the webinar, you can use the question tab on your screen to ask questions to my guest, and we will try to answer most of them. Of course, I can't promise that we'll be able to answer all of them, that we will have the time to all of them, but we will try, so don't be shy, you make your question. And I remember that unanswered question will be in any case answered by written and published on the EUMOFA website together with the video recording of this talk. So I now welcome my first guest, Griffin Carpenter. He is an environmental economist and fisheries specialist. To start, I would like to ask you a very basic question. Why are imports a concern in fisheries? Please, Griffin.
Thanks, Valentina. If I can just share my screen, there's a couple slides. I thought I would, kick off this discussion with a bit of background to the recent EUMOFA study on imports and small-scale fisheries that I contributed to. And there are 2 bits of essential context I think that we should establish. And the first is that seafood trade is a large and growing business. So we can look at this at the total level. We can see that seafood, if you group it all together, is the most traded food commodity in the world by value. It's also growing, and it's growing year on year. And this isn't just because the population is growing, that's about 2%, or because seafood production itself is growing, that's about 3.5%, mostly from aquaculture. But seafood trade itself is increasing, so that's increasing at 9% a year. So it's exceeding population growth, it's exceeding fisheries production. So it's becoming a much larger business, and with much larger impacts, we hypothesize on all the actors in supply chains. And the EU plays a really essential role in this global seafood market. We can look at that in two different ways. First, that the EU is important to seafood trade. It's a large import market. It's the single largest seafood destination market. So in recent years, about 30% of global seafood that is imported by the EU. That's almost 40% by value. Or you can look at the other way around, that seafood trade is important to the EU itself. So the EU is important to seafood trade, but the EU relies on seafood trade as well. So most of the seafood that is consumed in the EU actually comes from imports, about 60%. And we usually look at this from the consumer side and can see that there's been great quantities and diversity of seafood being brought to store shelves and fish counters and restaurant plates. But it could also have an impact on the producers, and it's a question that's not asked as often, but it's the question we were looking at in this study. And so that's the second point of essential context here, that while the impacts on consumers are pretty clear, the impacts on producers are less so. To be sure, policy concerns have come up on the terrestrial side, especially. Almost as old as trade itself, we hear concerns from domestic producers that imports might affect their businesses. And then this still goes on today. So just to give one recent example, in 2019, there was a hearing in the European Parliament on imports of citrus fruits from South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Turkey, and how that would affect citrus fruit prices in Greece and Spain. So it's still a concern that's brought up a lot, but as I say, not so much on the seafood side. Although we did get a recent example during the COVID crisis as member states attempted to support their local fishing industries with some measures. There were concerns that some of these measures were essentially anti-competitive to other producers within the EU, other exporters. So with these two bits of essential context, that kind of frames the study, why it came up, why we were looking into this topic. I just thought, before we get into the heart of the discussion, we'll just do a little bit of terminology, nothing too difficult, I hope. So the first point, and Valentina mentioned this in her intro, is the small scale fisheries themselves. So this is defined in the EU for data collection and for subsidies as this definition of less than 12 meters and not using towed fishing gear. So that's the definition we're using in this study as well. We're specifically looking at the impacts on small scale fisheries. And Raymond will be talking more about this particular fleet of the EU after I'm done. And the other thing to mention in this study is we are looking primarily at extra EU imports. So this is defining which case studies we picked, how we went about the analysis. We're looking particularly at these imports. There's certainly more that the EU can do about these imports in terms of policy than the internal market. Now, there is a delineation issue. Sometimes it's not always clear when you're looking at a trade flow where it originally came from. So you might have heard of this as the Rotterdam effect, where basically trade recorded to one country, its inclusion is only because of quasi-transit goods. So Netherlands being a large import country from outside the EU, and then it looks like Netherlands is the originator of tuna or something that they're probably not catching. So this really creates a lot of issues, and there's no easy way to solve it actually in terms of processing data. It can only be done with knowledge about the markets And Sebastian will talk about this in the case studies, the care that went into ensuring we're only looking at the trade flows that we were intending to. So now in terms of analyzing the impacts, there's two essential concepts that Valentina mentioned in the intro. One is about this issue of market integration. And what we mean by that is that, let's say that you're selling apples in the market, and I come up next and I open up a stand selling oranges, and there's a concern that my oranges will be affecting your apples. This is only true if people going to the market might have been buying apples and then they go to buy oranges. So they're substitute products. And importantly, how we test for this is that the price in one has some influence on the price in the other. So if your apples go on discount, I need to discount my oranges as well because I'm trying to reach those same consumers. So apples and oranges are both fruits. That's we might expect some sort of relationship there, but maybe apples versus rice or novelty mugs or something, we wouldn't see that effect. We wouldn't hypothesize. So market integration is a key concept we're looking here because it's a necessary condition for some sort of impact. And then just the last bit of context, last definition here is around market power, which is essentially the second condition we're looking here for there to be an impact. And it's the direction of effect. So just because we're selling apples and oranges next to each other, who is setting the price for who? And in general, it's the larger market, the larger producer. They tend to have more market power, and they're determining the price that the other one needs to respond to. So as I say, the two necessary conditions here, we're looking for markets that are integrated and ones where the small scale fleet in Europe would not have market power. There'd be the price taker, as you may have heard it before, the price taker rather than the price maker. And we can illustrate this as well. We look at this little diagram here. It's the only diagram I'll show, don't worry, where the two blue bubbles there are different markets. So we have a market for imported products. So from the orange country into the EU market, the blue bubble at the top, there is, let's say, a lobster that's going from Canada and the orange into the EU market. And then we also have some European lobster coming from the green circle there. And we want to know these two lobster markets, are they integrated? So how much overlap is there between those two blue circles? We also need to know about market power. So are the Canadian exporters determining the price of American lobster in the EU market? And then the EU market, the retail stores are determining the prices for the state fleet. Then we have a concern. These two conditions are met. The market power essentially transfers through European retail institutions to determine the market and the prices that the small scale fleet in Europe would have to pay. So that's most of the background context. One point that's important to emphasize is the case-specific nature of this. As you can tell, you need to know a lot about the different markets. It is not just a simple statistical analysis that you can do, discover where a market exists and discover where there's market power and integration. And this is why we're taking a really case-specific approach, analyzing the different markets, talking to processors, talking to retail institutions, asking how they determine their prices in order to get a better understanding of these market dynamics and where there might be an impact. So that's the background. We'll get into each of the cases and hopefully get a chance to discuss them. But I think the important points here are about these two necessary conditions that we're looking for to establish an impact, and then analyzing the markets on a case-specific basis to really understand what's happening there.
Thank you, Griffin. I was looking in the questions box if someone made questions. Okay, so no one for now, but I have a question on my own. You talked about the impact of imports on prices, but can imports affect the small-scale coastal fleet in other ways besides prices?
Yeah, it's a good question. Normally, we are concerned about the impact of imports because what it would mean for prices if imports are driving the price down for domestic producers. That's the main channel that's explored. That's where there's concern. Theoretically, there could be other effects where prices could even benefit, for example. So there might be a case where imports are actually for the same species, but they're off-season. And this actually increases the appeal of the species because maybe you get local production in the summer months, and in the winter months you can source from elsewhere. So then restaurants know they can put this species on their menu year round. There's more interest in it, more exposure in general. So potentially there could be positive impacts in that direction. There's other more nuanced effects as well, where local purchasers might change some of their standards or what they're requiring of domestic producers. So an example of this in fisheries would be MSC certification. If there's a source of imports coming into the EU market and it's MSC certified, and retailers want that sort of certification on their shelves, so they demand it of local producers as well. So that would be an increase in cost rather than lowering price, if you need to respond to that. Actually, there's a big issue in one of the case studies in cod in Sweden, where cod coming in from Norway is MSC certified. Local producers were struggling to certify their cod in the EU and had to respond to that. And just the last thing to mention is there's some economies of scale as well. So there could be beneficial aspects if, a crab processor maybe can't quite exist with the production made domestically in the EU, but with their imports as well, then there's enough volume there. They can make a solid business out of it. So that's another potential aspect for positive impacts of domestic producers from imports.
Okay, and what about other species? Because we mentioned that we are going to discuss more in detail about lobster, and we also said that the most significant impact was found to be on cod, lobster, and octopus. But what about other species? What about the top imported species? I was thinking like maybe shrimps, tuna. What about their impact on these species?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking in the study specifically at the small scale fleet. So some of the top species that come to mind weren't analyzed, as you might expect. So salmon from Norway, shrimp from Ecuador, let's say, or tuna. These are the top imported species, but we're looking at this overlap between imported species from outside the EU in particular, and local production, and seeing how those markets overlap. So there's not as much of a local production market for shrimp, for salmon, tuna. It comes up a little bit, and we'll get into kind of the inclusion criteria. We ended up with 13 case studies a little bit later, but yeah, you might not see some of the main species that we know are important.
Okay, so I have no more questions from my own for now. No questions was received, but the audience can ask them throughout the webinar, so maybe some others will come. So I guess now it's time to move on to my next guest, Raymond. Hi, Raymond. Raymond, I would say it's a policy officer at the EU Commission, involved in the assessment of the social dimension of fleet policies in DG MARE. The full scope of the small-scale coastal fleet across the EU and the fisheries it targets are extremely diverse, but the total value of its production is actually concentrated in a limited number of key species. In the report that we have recently released, we made an annex with country fishes for all EU member states with descriptive statistics and seafood trade flows. Raymond today is here to give us an overview on this sector. And then, as usual, you can ask him questions to elaborate more on his presentation. So Raymond, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you hear me well. I will not make a PowerPoint presentation, also due to some of the connection issues, and since we do not have that much time today, I first of all would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak here, and also thank the authors for the interesting study. I think each time we speak about small-scale fisheries, we see how little actually we know about them, and as Valentina indicated, it's a very complex picture, of course, that is there, and you see that even more if you look into those specific impacts that imports could have on this sector. So instead of giving a very overall presentation on small-scale fisheries within the European Union, I wanted to rather react from the common fisheries policy perspective to some of the findings of the study, and then connect that to some of the activities that we are undertaking or will be undertaking, which affect or which are related to small-scale fisheries. I think first of all, it's important indeed to recall again that we speak here about vessels smaller than 12 meters, not using towed gear. We know also that from the sector, sometimes there have been discussions on whether it would also not be better to include those that are using active gear. I think this is a question indeed that still is out there, but for the time being, indeed, small-scale fisheries in the legal setup, including, for instance, in our newly adopted European Maritime, Fisheries and Aquaculture funds, are those vessels smaller than 12 meters, not using active gear. If we look at the fleet register as it currently stands, so after Brexit, I just made a quick check, not selecting on active, non-active gear, but I see, and that is more or less the proportion I think that we have always seen, that almost 6 out of 7 of the vessels within the EU fleet are the small-scale fisheries vessels. So it's really an important proportion. At the same time, not only with regard to the targeted species, but also with regard to the geographical coverage, I think it's important to underline that, of course, specifically in the Mediterranean, we have a very large fleet of small-scale fisheries, and which is also being addressed in the context, for instance, of the GFCM in the more international context. To come to, as I said, some of the reactions to the study which underline the efforts that are taken also under the common fisheries policy, I think one of the interesting findings is not only related to the impact of imports, for instance, but also the conclusion on the importance of non-trade impacts on small-scale fisheries. I think the study again underlines once again the complexity of the situation, also the fact that the local situation is determining for whether or not there are impacts, be it from imports or be it on other, let's say, market operations that either operate locally or regionally, nationally, or within the EU market, and then beyond that with the external market. So I think this study again points out that the local situation, the specific situation of small-scale fisheries, is so important to take into account, and that puts, of course, a specific challenge to the policymakers, where there's quite a lot of emphasis on paying more attention to small-scale fisheries. We have, of course, in our common fisheries policy regulations, some specific provisions which explicitly referred to small-scale fisheries, also to coastal fisheries, for instance. I mentioned here in particular the Article 2 of the CFP regulation, which refers to a fair standard of living. But we also have the Article 5, for instance, which is about the access to waters. So the derogation that can be provided to those vessels that traditionally fish within coastal waters. Another aspect that also I've been having the pleasure of to work with Griffin on is the quota access. The quota access, the Article 17 of the CFP regulation also refers there to those fisheries which have less impact. And that is maybe another point which goes a bit beyond our discussion today. But small-scale fisheries is often seen directly in connection with the lesser impact. However, we see, and I mentioned the Mediterranean, that if there's a big scale of fisheries taking place with smaller scale vessels, especially with certain techniques, we know that the impact can be quite significant. So that's yet another challenge I think we need to take into account. I think besides here the discussion on the CFP application as such, there's of course an important role given to the representation, increasing role given to the representation of the sector itself in designing policies and contributing to policies. Producer organizations were mentioned already, and that also of course remains a challenge to ensure the appropriate representation also of small-scale fishers within those producer organizations. We also have ongoing discussion, for instance, in the context of the advisory councils, also there to ensure that small-scale fisheries is well presented. I finally wanted to come to a very important instrument we have, and that I mentioned already before, the recently adopted European Maritime, Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund will continue the support to small-scale fisheries. And in particular, I mentioned the local situation, which is so important. And in this regard, of course, the fisheries local action groups play a very important role, not only to give a role in the governance to small-scale fisheries, but also very concretely support these small-scale fisheries operators connected to the local communities. This is a bit the context that I wanted to set from the common fisheries policy perspective. I think once again, it is very important to see what is the impact of the different trade flows on the local situation, very local situation of small-scale fisheries. For us, as from the policy side, it again underlines also to see this, to see the picture as much as possible as a whole, connecting the different dots that we have within the common fisheries policy and supporting the sector where we can. For that point of view, of course, this study gives us important pointers to where there can be impacts for different small-scale fisheries operators for specific species, and that can maybe also guide the member states when they direct funding in certain areas and support the sector, for instance, to gain a stronger voice in the governance and in the operation of the markets that they are active in. I will finish my intervention here, and of course look forward to our further interactions.
Yeah, actually, we received some questions in the course of your presentation. Some other are mostly a couple are destined to Griffin. I will give him the questions at the end in the Q&A session. Now I'm going to focus on questions for the Raymond intervention. Someone's asking what can be done at EU level to ensure that the small-scale coastal fleet gets a fair or at least a fairer share of the fishing opportunities available. And another is asking how can the common fishery policy better take account of the local specificities that determine the operation of the small-scale coastal fleet. These are the quick two questions we got for you.
The second question, can you please repeat, Valentina, because I did not get it entirely.
Han is asking, how can the common fisheries policy better take account of the local specificities that determine the operation of the small-scale coastal fleet?
Okay, thank you. Yes, so on the first point, this is indeed, as you announced in the beginning, Valentina, I'm working also on the social dimension of fisheries within the EU context. One of the issues that we have looked at, and indeed I refer there also to Griffin, who participated in the work of the SSCF on this, was to look into how are the quota allocation systems functioning in the member states. As you may know, the CFP regulation provides quite a broad leeway, a big leeway to the member states to actually design the way the quota allocation systems are designed. However, there are clear references also to the environmental, economic, and social criteria to be taken into account. And in the context of those social criteria, we have, being DG MARE, we have asked the SSCF to look further into this and also to see whether it could be connected to the small-scale fisheries fleet. That appeared to be not an easy exercise. It was very much also about making the inventory of what could possibly be the criteria that were used by the member states. I think it's not always easy. Not all member states are as transparent on the type of criteria that are applied. Those that apply them often take as a starting point the acquired rights. But I think Griffin can say more about that because he made this great inventory for the SSCF on this. But to make a long story short, I think we have at the EU level not a direct means to say, okay, for instance, that part needs to go to the small-scale fisheries. However, we have this very clear reference, once again, also to social criteria, again, also to the criteria that I just mentioned on the lower impact fisheries that in principle would need to be given, I would not call it preferential treatment, but would be given due attention, need to be given due attention within the quota allocation system. So we can integrate member states on this and sit together with them and see what they actually do on that. And hopefully by learning from each other, the countries will pay more attention to small-scale fisheries there. Then quickly on the second point, yes, I highlighted that as well. We, of course, with the new common fisheries policy regulation, we went into the direction already of regionalization. So we want to indeed get the fisheries rules closer to the actual places where the fisheries are being done in order to adapt the rules as much as possible to those regional situations. But I think indeed, and I mentioned the representation issue, we need to take that a step further in order to even better take into account the small-scale fisheries situation. And once again, with our funding, we also can help small-scale fisheries raising their voice and having a voice in the governance system.
Sorry, thank you for your answers. We have received several other questions, but we need to go ahead and then we will answer them at the end of our talk. Now it's time to move on to my next guest, Sebastian, to talk about the case study. Sebastian Metz is a fisheries economist who wrote part of the study. Sebastian, you are here today to present them. At the beginning of the talk, we said the reason why the findings of these three, cod, lobster, and octopus, are included in the report are more analyzed in detail, which is their integration between production and imports. I will make you a question to start your presentation because it's it's coming from me now. So why did you decide to focus on lobster today? Why this one deserves a special attention?
So thank you, Valentina, for inviting me to join. So why lobster? Just going to share my screen in the meantime. We've, as Griffin said, and I hope you can see my screen, but I see it's white, so I think there's an issue here. Never mind. I'm going to stop sharing. It's going to be easier. Why lobster? On the 3 case studies we've looked into, so we have cod caught in Sweden that is competing with Norwegian cod, octopus caught in Spain, and mostly we focused on Galicia because that's where we had good data. Octopus caught in Galicia is competing with octopus caught in Portugal, but also in North Africa. And we have lobster in France competing with lobster coming from Northern America and other countries in Europe. Why lobster? Because lobster is a small-scale species by heart, almost entirely caught by under 12-meter vessels using pots, either on the French side or on the exporter side. So the UK, Ireland, but also Canada and the USA are all mostly lobster caught by small-scale fishers. So it's an entire network of small-scale fishers competing with each other, and they compete on the French market. So I wanted to show you a picture, so I'm going to try that again. It doesn't want, no, it doesn't want. Anyway. Doesn't want. Anyway, I wanted to show you good pictures of lobsters I found, because basically when we're talking about cod in Norway and Sweden, it's cod, it's the same species. Here we're talking about 2 lobsters. Homarus gammarus is the European lobster and Homarus americanus is the American or Canadian lobster, depending on where you are. Those 2 products are considered not entirely substitutable by specialists. So if you're talking to French retailers, to Spanish seafood specialists, even in the UK, all specialists will tell you that these are 2 different lobsters. But when we are talking about consumers, some consumers switch from one to the other without making so much differences. So we, in our case studies, basically we looked at the data, but we also contacted stakeholders. We contacted producers, processors, retailers, and sometimes we tried to even discuss with restaurants. It was during the first part of the pandemic, so it was a bit complicated to get restaurants on the phone, but we were lucky to have some of them. And basically, some of the retailers were telling us that, in fact, there are, from the consumer perspective, basically 2 segments of the market. You have the consumers that are seafood lovers. In France, we call them CSP+. So usually that are the people that have the higher pay, or the more educated, and usually older. So you don't have kids at home. Your food budget is higher than a young family with a lot of kids. So you can afford buying expensive seafood. So these ones, the seafood lovers, they're not switching from the European lobster to the American lobster because they see the difference. Then you have the budget group, the people that are more interested in buying a seafood for a certain amount. And when you're talking to retailers, they tell you that for these particular clients, the impact of the American lobster on the European lobster is massive. Because in the season, so right now, a European lobster can be found at around €25 a kilo in a supermarket. At that level, a consumer will buy the European lobster. You come Christmas, you end up having a European lobster around €45 a kilo. €45 a kilo, people on the budget are not going to buy that lobster. They're going to switch to a more affordable solution, which is the American lobster. And when you look at the whole European production, France is a tiny player. UK is the largest player in Europe. And when you look at the global production, Canada and US are massive players. 20 years ago, they started to export live lobster to Europe. So now on the European market, we have competing products, live lobsters, coming from either side. So when we looked into the data, we realized that although the French small-scale fishers seems to have their say and to have the market power compared to the British, because the British customers are not as fancy in terms of switching to one lobster to the other. We realized that the Northern American lobster have an influence on the European price. And this was not a surprise for us, but it was a surprise for some of our stakeholders, because some of the stakeholders were telling us, no, it's two different markets. American and Canadian lobsters are one specific product that is imported and people know the difference. In fact, when you're really talking to people on the west coast of France, maybe they know the difference. But most of the consumers of France do not know the difference. When they see the lobster cooked, it's red. If it's not labeled properly, it's lobster. So in a restaurant, it's lobster. They don't make the difference. So as they don't make the difference, then the products are becoming more substitutable. And in our tests, we showed that basically the Northern American price has a slight effect on the French price. The French price has an effect on the British price, and the British price is British. It doesn't have an effect on the others. So that's the influence we have in our case study for lobster. We also had differences in terms of the approach of the management of the fishery, because Raymond just talked about quotas. There's no quota in lobster. It's not a quota fishery. So fishing opportunities is not a feature of this small scale part. And there's no question of quota, there's no question of PO. Most of the lobster fishers are not in PO. So there's not the same market organization you would have as in PO species, like basically most of the whitefish. What else did I wanted to tell you? Well, one of the key features also is that in France, something which is quite interesting is when you're going to Rungis market. So Rungis is a wholesale market in Paris. I have not two products, but they have three products. They have American lobster, European lobster, and homard breton, lobster from Brittany. Because in Paris, they make the difference between the lobster that is coming from French waters and the lobster coming from Northern European waters, which was quite interesting for us because usually people are not tending to make those differences in the market. And for that particular species, they do. And it's because having homard breton on your menu for high-end restaurant is a sign of perceived quality, when it's exactly the same species as the lobster that is caught in Ireland and the UK. And I think I've extended my time. What else did I wanted to tell you? Nothing more about lobster, except the fact that, one of the French organizations, so it's not a PO, it's an association, tried to label the lobster. So they call that homard du Cotentin. So they add, on top of the fact that it's French lobster, they add another regional denomination, basically to narrow their market and to try to gain more market power.
Thank you, Sebastian. We have received some questions for you. Regarding, you mentioned UK as an important trading partner in the French lobster case. An user is asking, have you explored the potential effect of Brexit in this case?
So, on the statistic part, we've been retrospective. So we had only time series that were dating before the exit of the UK from the single market. From a research perspective, this is one of the very interesting case studies, because it's almost a clean case study in terms of trades. There are only a very few number of players. There is some member state, there's Northern America, and now there's UK, and UK is the largest producer in Europe. So in 5 years' time, if you ask me the question, statistically, we may be able to start to see something. Now, what we've seen so far, it's a combination of the COVID situation and the changes in the way the flow was going through the channel in January, February. Most of the producers or most of the exporters were struggling right now. Some specialists decided to stop. The question is, did they use that situation to say, no, we're stopping and we're not going further, or did they really had a huge long-term issue? We're not able to say that at this stage. But it's sure that this case particularly is going to be extremely interesting for researchers.
Yeah, of course it is. Another question, you mentioned eco-labeling in the French case. A question is, has eco-labeling an influence on the international trade flows?
So we didn't anticipate that at first when we looked at those cases, but we realized that all three cases, so cod in Sweden, lobster in France, and octopus in Spain, have an eco-label perspective. Cod in Sweden, the small-scale cod cannot be certified because the stock of cod in the Baltic is not at the proper level to be certified. But they're competing against Norwegian cod that is MSC certified. And in a country like Sweden, where eco-label has an influence on buyers' perception, the small-scale fishers may struggle to enter retailing. They can go to niche markets, so if they can sell locally to restaurants or to fishmongers, but they may have a barrier to entry to the retail. In France, the MSC eco-label is viewed as a sign of quality. So it's more a question of differentiation. And it was also a question of peace agreements between the fishers in Normandy and the fishers in Jersey, because there were discussions for years about who can fish where. And this was a joint effort in the eco-label. And in Spain, it's not directly the case study we looked at, but while we were discussing with stakeholders, some of them pointed us to a local MSC labeled fishery in northern Spain, in Asturias, where basically small-scale fishers that were usually targeting Spanish markets were now exporting because of the eco-label. So it was the eco-label for them was even reversing their position. Before they were competing with imported octopus to Spain, and with this eco-label, it seems that they were basically being absorbed by markets where eco-label has an influence, such as Northern Europe or even some part of the US market.
Okay, thanks. We have some other questions, but we need to rush because it's 10 to 11 and we need to rush now. So let's move on. Let's leave the floor to Griffin again. I'd like to ask him to illustrate the main findings of the analysis, the conclusions you were able to draft. So to conclude this talk and give some highlights of the whole study, please go ahead.
Great, thanks, Valentina. And I'll share my screen again. So yeah, as hopefully it has become clear as Sebastian has been speaking, that testing for market integration and power is quite difficult. You need to have a lot of knowledge about each particular situation. So how we went going about this, not just for the 3 case studies, but for all the markets we could find, is we started with a list of the top 5 species landed by the small scale fleet in each of the fisheries member states. So that's about 22 member states, five species each. So there's a potential list there of 110 species. But then we had to start excluding some. So one particular issue is we're looking for prices of just the small scale fleet. So it's easy enough to get the price of cod more broadly in Sweden, but we specifically need the price of cod for the small scale fleet. So you would get that if you found auction prices or otherwise port prices for an area where there's a large share of the small scale fleet. So sometimes we could find that, sometimes we couldn't. Other times there'd be difficulty identifying a substitute product where you're just looking at the trade flows that are coming in and you say, well, we don't know which of these species are actually in the same market. Again, this isn't something you statistically identify. You need to know something about the market in each case. Another problem would just be in the time series. If there's missing data for some years or even some months, it corrupts the time series and you can't do the statistical analysis anymore. So the point is, at the end of all of these exclusion criteria of all the species and countries we looked at, we end up with a list of 13. And 3 of those 13 are the case studies that went into more detail. But more broadly, there were 13 cases that we could look at. So these will come up on the screen now. This is just a table really condensing some of the results where we find in a couple of cases, there might be case for concern. So cod in southern Sweden, we find that there's some market integration, cod from Norway and locally cod in Sweden is being sold in the same type of market, and Swedish cod caught locally is the price taker. They're much smaller than the Norwegian imports, so they have to respond to the prices of the imports. So that's one case. And the other case would be lobster, not lobster in France, but lobster in the UK. So lobster in the UK is being sold in the same sort of markets as American lobster coming in from the US and Canada. And again, the UK is the price taker there, smaller volumes compared with the imports. So these are cases I would focus on as potential concern. More broadly, you can see a mixed picture. Sometimes we found market integration, sometimes not. Sometimes the small scale is the price taker, sometimes not. Perhaps that's what to be expected. If I can maybe posit one general trend, and there's only 13 cases, so this is with caution. The Northern European countries tend to be more of the higher degrees of market integration and less market power. So in particular, Sweden, UK, Ireland. This probably makes sense if we think about the role that seafood plays in southern countries, let's say, more local markets, more of a strong tradition there, different ways of purchasing fish, maybe in the local market versus a supermarket chain. So hard to extrapolate from 13 cases, but that's potentially something that as we have better data, let's say in a couple of years, we can revisit. As I say, we need to be a bit cautious in extrapolating because there are a whole bunch of species and countries that aren't covered here. And, would we expect to see more or less market integration or more or less market power in the thousands of species and countries not included? And the answer is we're a bit ambiguous on this point because we can picture this in different directions. One is that because these are the top species, that was one of our criteria. So these are the top species, they're larger markets. So the other ones that were excluded are smaller markets. That might make them more likely to differentiate in a niche market. If you're only selling hundreds of kilograms, you can differentiate, just sell to a local market rather than being forced to compete in a retail chain. So in that sense, they might be more insulated from imports. But equally, because the other examples are smaller markets, it may mean that there's a lack of familiarity. So you can't differentiate if no one knows that species in particular. So you could kind of see it both ways, the fact that we have to extrapolate from these larger species and market smaller ones. So at the end, we're a bit ambiguous on that. There are, I think, some conclusions that we can reach. So I'll just go through a couple that come to my mind. One is that, you know, in the course of the case studies, it became clear that sometimes imports were identified as an issue, but they were never identified as the only issue, and never as the biggest issue. So, you know, this often happens when you're doing interviews, but they start about one thing and turn to something completely different. So we'd be asking about you know, price setting and imports, and then in the end, something like the state of the cod stock in the Baltic would come up as an issue that you weren't expecting. You know, weather, Brexit, any number of issues could come up. So very rarely were stakeholders identifying trade and imports as the biggest issue. Which leads to the second point, which is about strategies that producers are using for market differentiation. Sebastian mentioned this earlier with Australian octopus using eco-labeling as a differentiation. There is also on the flip side, some of this happening in Sweden. So the local fishers couldn't get MSC certification, so they had to differentiate in some other ways. So they're just selling to restaurants as opposed to supermarkets. And some fishers are even differentiating by doing the exact opposite of this. So using trade as an opportunity. So they're trying to sell abroad. This gets a little bit more difficult in creating a brand abroad. People might know a specific region, Galicia of Spain, and octopus from there. But once you go abroad, that brand is not as evident. Another point that's come up already in this discussion is about economic power. And certainly when we're discussing market differentiation, this is something that comes up a lot. Other studies have found that fishers only receive a small share of the economic benefits through the supply chain. So this is a larger issue than just trade itself. That needs to be discussed and explored. And I think, yeah, a lot of the trade discussion ultimately comes back to this point about auction prices. Is that the best way for fishers to get high prices? How can producer organizations help? You know, different ways of ensuring that the small scale fleet has that market power, even if you can't control market integration and how consumers think about different products, even if you can't control differentiation. Can you control market power and have more of a role as a price maker in the market? And the last one I'll end with is about the role for non-trade policies here, because I think there are concerns sometimes expressed about the degree of market integration and therefore the effect that imports could have, but it's not clear, let's say, from the 13 cases we looked at, that this was true across the board or even in most cases. So, you know, you can look at this in a lot of different ways. I look at it kind of in optimistic ways. If there was market integration in every single case, there would be no role for institutions or for policy. You can't affect the market. What's the point of a producer organization if they can't actually determine the prices and shift things at all? But that's not what we find. So, you know, the results are mixed, but we do see that in a lot of cases, policies, institutions still matter. And that gives us potential strategies to give the small scale fleet more power in determining their prices and ultimately their livelihoods. So we can explore each of these cases in particular. Why is one able to differentiate their product and not another? But I think that's one of the few broad conclusions I'm confident with extrapolating, is that it's not all trade and markets. There's other institutions that are having an effect, and we can try to use those achieve the objectives that we're seeking.
Thank you, Griffin. We have actually reached the end of the planned webinar, but in any case, I would leave 10 minutes just to read some unanswered questions and make a question and answer section. So I invite both Griffin, Raymond, and Sebastian to answer them. Before we start, I just would like to remind the audience that will not hear their question asked that you can, in any case, leave your questions in the EUMOFA website in the leave us a comment section, and then we will answer you via email. So a question we received before, this was, I think it's destined to Griffin, regards the minimum wage across member states, the need for a level playing field. The question is, do you feel this also gives an advantage to those from countries outside the EU selling their product with a lower production cost? I think Griffin can ask them. So, but you decide among yourselves.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's one of course that comes up in trade more broadly, whether it's you know, in car production, electronics. We're used to thinking about this, that production costs can be lower elsewhere if there's lower wages and therefore prices are lower. And that's, yeah, a fundamental point of trade. With minimum wages, it's interesting to think about this because we're just so far from that point in fisheries. You know, there's been some discussion at the EU level, I'm not following it particularly closely, but about ways that you can harmonize minimum wages across countries. And of course, the wage setting procedures are different in many member states, whether it's through collective bargaining or some corporatist model. So there's challenges there already, but we're even further away in fisheries because the minimum wage isn't a fundamental part of how most fishers receive their wages. It's usually based on some crew share model. So it's a concern, but I don't really see the immediate policy solutions for this, because minimum wages, if we change that law in Europe, it wouldn't have an immediate impact on fisheries as long as the crew share model is still what's being used. We're probably at a point where we can start debating that crew share model and to see if other forms of wage setting are more appropriate in fisheries. I would like to see more of that debate because we do see more broadly profitability is increasing in the EU fleet. So how can we ensure that the economic rent, the gains of the fisheries are being filtered through to all the workers and not just the boat owners? I think that's another big question here. But in terms of the broader question about trade, yeah, it's absolutely true that production costs are lower elsewhere, and that's why the prices are lower of the product. And that's exactly why there's a concern for domestic production. But as we know, consumers enjoy the flip side of that. They enjoy having cheaper products, and that's exactly why the EU is a big importer of many products, including seafood.
Thank you. There's a question which is destined to Raymond, but Raymond, before asking this, if you want, you can integrate the comments made by Griffin and Sebastian so far. The question for you is, what concrete actions can be taken to enhance the access to market and regulatory information to small-scale fishers so that they can start to consider extending market opportunities?
Yes, it's quite a broad question indeed. Maybe before trying to give some indications on that one, just a reaction to what was just discussed on the minimum wages. I think the issue, I completely agree with Griffin, especially small-scale fisheries, of course, in the majority of cases, as far as I know, these are owners of the vessels who themselves, let's say, maybe employ or have one or another collaborator at most. who then often share in the let's say the revenue generated by the catch, but there's no wage relationship, let's say, often present in these small-scale fisheries. However, there's the broader issue of the treatment of imports, and that is also affecting the larger scale fisheries, and that's especially related to the application of certain international standards, both on, for instance, working and living conditions, like the ILO Work and Fishing Convention, which is now generally applied or applicable within the European Union, where there are specific, more stringent requirements for the vessels of 24 meters and longer, but there are still also requirements for the smaller vessels there. And also more generally, the sustainability requirements, of course, that we are now very much emphasizing within the Green Deal, etc. So you have a number of standards that are applied and that are rising, I would say, within the European Union, because, and rightly so, of course, but is the rest of the world going into that same direction? And is indeed the imported seafood also in that sense following the trend, or do we see an increasing discrepancy basically between the standards that are applied within the EU and those that are currently applied to the imported seafood? So this is really a discussion which becomes even more strong with the application of those international standards, in particular within the EU. Then on the other point, which is somewhat related because it's about, let's say, the way small-scale fishers can distinguish themselves or make themselves known on the market or explore new market opportunities. I think that the most concrete tool, again, is through those fisheries local action groups. For instance, we have seen as a very concrete example a mobile app that has been developed with EU funding, which is called Mon Pêcheur in France, which actually connected the fishers, or is connecting the fishers with the direct consumers in the wider area around where the fisherman or fisherwoman is operating. So there are different tools there, I think, to either reach out more locally, but also there is, of course, the support also under the current EMFF and the upcoming fund, the MFAF as it is called, to support also small-scale fishers in their marketing efforts, but also in their efforts in order to enter new markets. And some of the labeling examples are also illustrative of that. Where it comes in, I saw in the question also the access to the regulatory side. I think there I come back also on the governance issue. I think generally speaking, small-scale fisheries is by definition a sector where any top-down initiative will be a failure if there is no involvement of the fishers themselves. Indeed, because of this very specificity, the very local situation often that they are operating in, they need to be involved in the rules or the policies that are affecting them and that are being applied. That is once again where these local action groups come into play.
Thank you, thank you. To close this session, I would like to ask to Sebastian this unanswered question from your intervention before. Do you think that the small-scale coastal fleet origin is a commercial advantage? Did you feel that consumers, retailers care where the product comes from? Did you assess this through your interviews?
So some of the interviews were focused on that, and since the pandemic, we've seen in some member states some push to eat local for basically everything, and fish in particular. The thing is, my perception is that it worked better in some part of Europe than others. If you're talking to French, Spanish, and Italian consumers, and you tell them that the local seafood is interesting, they're going to listen to you. Some other member states, and UK as a former member state, doesn't work that well. So it's really a question of consumers' perception, and then it's not small scale origin as just as a logo. It has to be tied with other consideration. If you're a small scale fisher but you do not care about quality, you can say you can put all the small scale flags you want. It's not going to work with consumers. It's always a question of basically a mixed setup. It's small scale origin, it's quality, it's freshness. Some consumers do care. Some retailers start to say they care. The question is, they cared during the COVID crisis because they didn't have fish to put on their counters, so they had to say something. In France, we had this huge debate about help the local fishers, and we even had last week a push from fishers saying that they didn't like imports. So we're even going a step bit too far in my perspective. But the question is it going to last? And that's retailers, they see the volumes going through. They don't see the quality going through.
Thank you for your reply. So now it's it's the end of our webinar, but before leaving you, I would like to ask each of my colleagues joining this talk to just in a minute give you a key closing message that they want to leave us with. We can start, I don't know, with Griffin, then Sebastian, then Raymond. It's okay if that's okay for you.
Yeah, certainly. It's a message I kind of concluded my talk with, but I'll return to it now, and that's just the role of other institutions, because I suppose for this case study we were looking at the impact of imports on prices, and sometimes we found that was a channel that had influence, sometimes not, but we weren't specifically trying to identify which other channels could be having an influence if not imports. So there's certainly lots to do there, and I think of huge policy relevance in the EU to see what role our producer organizations having, what role are auctions having, how about policies around access. So we've answered one part of the picture, and much more to come. The other thing that I'll mention here is the role of exports, because we are looking at one side, what's the effect of imports on the small scale fleet. Some of the small scale fleet are actually exporters. So it's just important to keep that context in mind as we're having this conversation. It's a two-way street. Exports have been a real lifeline for many of the small scale fisheries, and we should keep that in mind.
Thank you. Sebastian.
For me, the big conclusion is that, contrarily to what usually we hear around, that small-scale fishers are crushed by cheap imports, the different case studies we've looked at show us that even if there are big volumes at low prices entering the EU, small-scale fishers have an edge. And of course, there can be public intervention, but they can already start themselves to focus on quality, to focus on local routes to market, to focus on differentiation, either by labeling or eco-labeling. And for me, it's a message of hope. It's even if the world wants to sell us their cheap seafood, our small-scale fishers can survive and thrive.
Thank you. Raymond, the floor is yours now.
Yes, I think these optimistic final words from Sebastian, I can only underline, and I think the small-scale fisheries, they are faced with so many challenges, not to mention, for instance, generational renewal, indeed, now the COVID crisis. At the same time, I agree with Sebastian that the examples that were given, at least some of them, show that, as he calls it, small-scale fisheries have an edge or can have an edge if they pick up those opportunities. And in order to accompany them in that, and also maybe in order to create some of the opportunities, I think there's indeed a role for the policymakers, once again, with the right involvement of the sector itself. I would just, one final word of caution, we are very wary about a proliferation of all kind of eco-labels, etc. As you may know, we are also working at the EU level again on the marketing standards, for instance, and also the other labeling of food products, again in the context also of the farm to fork strategy, etc. And we also will try to channel that, but due account will need to be taken in that context also of the smaller producers, including small-scale fisheries. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so it's 11:20. I guess now we really finished. I would like to thank you all, my guests, the participants, the EUMOFA team, my colleagues, and of course the European Commission. I hope to see you again soon for a new talk. And as I was saying before, we'll let you know once the video recording of this talk is online, so you can share it, you can see it again, you can share it on your social media account, and maybe help us to spread the word. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye.